I want to start by saying it's highly ironic that we're sitting here this morning to renew huge powers to the state on a day when tens of thousands of workers will wake up to the realisation that a learned judge of the High Court, who earns over €220,000 a year, has decided in his wisdom that an electrician who may earn €45,000 a year is possibly overpaid, and then strikes down a sectoral employment order that will impact on tens of thousands of workers who are already on low pay. This is a war on workers, Minister, and it's time for workers to fight back. But importantly, I want to say to you, Minister, that last night's decision of the High Court must be appealed by the state and those pay rates defended. But the reason we're here for this annual event that's so important to the state was called by a previous deputy a pantomime of sorts. The Minister makes the same speeches and TDs do the same hand-wringing and the same solemn commitments are made. But this legislation, like financial legislation that was passed in previous years, is based on a myth that we are in an emergency where there's a threat to the very state and its institutions. The usual vague warnings, they're usually about Republican terrorism or possible jihadist terrorism, and now it's the need to combat gangland crime. And those that support this legislation will accept that it's a draconian attack on fundamental rights, rights guaranteed by our Constitution, rights that were hard won and fought for by citizens, rights that set limits on arbitrary powers of the state and its institutions. But I want to be clear, we totally oppose this legislation. We don't buy into these arguments, and they fall apart when they're examined. Emergency power and legislation has seeped into the very fabric of this state, and it is clear that the state doesn't want to let go of it. This Act takes away the right to trial by jury, one of the greatest rights won by democracies. It replaces normal rules on evidence and the right to remain silent. It allows for citizens to be jailed for years on the word of a senior Garda based on no other evidence than their opinion. It bequeaths a frightening arbitrary power on the forces of the state who are in reality unaccountable and unelected. I want to deal briefly with what has now replaced terrorism or jihadist threats as the main ideology and the bogeyman to justify this legislation, and that's gangland crime. Like other deputies, I know too well the consequences of gangland crime. It's communities like the ones that I represent that feel its effects most strikingly. It's communities like the one that I represent where young men are killed and do the killing. My simple question for the advocates of this bill is, has this legislation and the emergency measures in it succeeded in stopping gangland crime? Has it broken down the cartel of guns and the wealth that flows from it? Has it smashed the drugs trade, the rock on which these gangs are based? And no, it hasn't. If this Act is the answer to anything, then is the question not how do we stop gangland crime? If we want to pull the ring from under gangland criminals, then we should be seeking ways to remove their money and their wealth which is based on drug trade. We would take truly radical measures, like decriminalising drugs. We would invest heavily in the communities that breed the alienation and poverty that builds the drug trade. There's ample evidence in terms of law and prosecution cases that are alternatives which for some reason this state has refused to look at, like anonymising the jury service, using technology to hide identity of jurors, etc. Instead, we invest in the powers of senior Gardaí that can see someone jailed with no real evidence. Last year, Judge Tara Burns acquitted 2 men of IRA membership after the head of the Garda Special Detective Unit refused to disclose belief evidence to the prosecution. And this meant that Gardaí were seeking a conviction without disclosing evidence to the defendant's legal team, the court or the DPP. Surely this is a warning that the evidence threshold that we give in this legislation is too low, too dangerous, and that the threat of the miscarriage of justice is very, very real. We empower the DPP to make decisions on who gets their constitutional right to a jury and who doesn't. We have real emergencies in this state. We have a housing emergency, a health emergency. We have utter failure in our system of childcare and care of the elderly. But do we see the state or the main parties in this House rushing to pass emergency legislation and equating huge powers to bodies to deal with those crises? No, we don't. We are totally opposed to this legislation. It doesn't work and it will not work in its intent.